are proposing to limit the number of days that these can be held up to 4 days total. And also, once there's 100 or more people, that's generally how we would define these types of special temporary events. Things there that would be exempt, obviously, would be any assembly related to a previously approved like special use permit or family events, those sorts of things. We're also proposing to limit these to no more than 2 events per year per property. So you won't be able to hold an unlimited number of events on any given property. It will be restricted to just those 2. And then there we talk about, obviously, the information that we're going to want, and that'll be listed in the criteria, which will be a site layout plan, which will indicate where the activities are, where the parking's located. We will obviously require that all parking be outside of the right-of-way fully, and the events themselves cannot extend into public rights-of-way. And the planning director will have authority to determine whether an event's exempt from the zoning requirements in this case. Also, as I said, the zoning designation of the property will have to be agricultural, commercial, or industrial in nature. So we're not permitting these in residential zones. And for obvious reasons, if something unexpected or intrusive like that would occur in a residential zone, it would obviously cause some issues with compatibility. We feel in agricultural, commercial, industrial type zones, that shouldn't be an issue, particularly with the limitations that we're putting on it. And these things, again, as I said, would not contain any permanent structures. So these are designed to be completely temporary. The site is cleaned up and is returned to its state that it was prior to the event afterward. So in general there, as you can see, again, those are the items that will go into the new standards. It will create a new section or a new article, a new subsection in Article 13. And then the creation of the permit will be listed in Article 15. And we have some additional information that we'll ask for on application. This will be staff approved administratively. So other departments would be involved. And then we also would like, obviously, the explanation of what the event is and the number of people and that sort of thing, which we'll develop on that permit when we get it created. So I think that summarizes the proposed amendment, and I can take any questions.
Do you have a reason for the 2 limit? When I was thinking of this, I was thinking, okay, Christmas Village, Haunted Forest, something like maybe more than 2 a year, but not continuously having events.
Yeah, so I think the reason that we did that largely was so that you wouldn't have a piece of property that had, multiple events all year round, transient in nature, coming and going. It tends to keep things, keeps things a little bit more managed and controlled that way. So you don't have sites that become sort of de facto mobile community event sites.
To go.
Yeah.
If they, like, for example, if they wanted to do it over a 2 weekend period, does each weekend count as an individual event, or is that all part of the day of, like 2 days on one weekend and 2 days the next weekend, or?
The way we've envisioned this is it would apply to consecutive days. However, I think that based on how we're proposing it, though, you could potentially do 2 weeks. So you could do, you're saying like 2 days, one weekend, 2 days the next weekend, in other words. As long as it did not exceed 4 days, that's possible.
They would still have to tear it down after the first 4-day period, though, right? Under this,
I think in reality, we would want to measure it as 4 continuous days. That's one allowance. If you want to do it again, it's going to have to be another one, because otherwise you're dismantling it.
Right.
And if you've already removed it, then you're not continuing it. It kind of gets hard to spread them out.
And that would make it.
And the intent is to manage this as much as possible. The reasons for a lot of these controls is there's no site improvements proposed. So we don't want overuse of a site that does not have paved parking, does not have lots of things on a site that you would expect. If you want to do an event on a commercial site, you won't be subject to these things. If you're doing it in a zone that already allows this and you're on an approved site,
Yep.
you can do things a lot differently than this. This is to do things where it otherwise is not permitted for the most part.
Would the setup, for example, a lot of activities might require a lot of setup. Like I know when we've gone to some of these similar type shows up in the Twin Cities and in Kansas City. I mean, there's a lot of setup. A lot of them have their own little house or whatever, a little shack thing with a little stage and things like that. They would have to have some time to set up. They wouldn't be able to come in the first day of the show and have it pop right up.
And I think that's why we put 4 days in, assuming you had a Friday for setup, Saturday and Sunday for the event,
Okay.
and a Monday to clean up if you had to. That was my thinking behind the 4 days, was
Yeah.
to give setup and cleanup time to it.
Yes, the setup and tear down is within that 4 day.
So if they did a second weekend, they'd have to tear down and then
Yeah.
set back up again.
I think I think that's how I believe this should be structured. That's how I would administer it, unless there's express language that says something different.
Okay.
And I don't think we envision this as large regional draws.
No. I think in the past, they've always been fairly local.
Yeah, I mean, not that people don't come to events from outside your town, but I don't think this is designed to be hosting a 2-day concert event that's drawing thousands of
Yeah.
people. That's going to be a struggle. But
Couple questions about the, is there a fee structure or an application cost for the permit?
yeah, there'll be, I'm not sure which category it'll go in. It'll be some version of a zoning permit, which has, I can't recall right now, what, $150 fee.
I believe so. Yeah, approximately.
And then if the authority is vested in the planning director to approve this, does it meet the due process requirements in a meeting? Is there appeals process if it's denied?
Any determination by staff can be appealed to the zoning board of adjustment.
And then I guess my last question is, what about, how are protests and other assemblies like that handled in the city code? I mean, would this apply to if a student group wanted to get together and protest something, would they need a permit for this? And would it apply under this section?
I can't really comment. The zoning ordinance doesn't address assembly of the public in public places. This is not meant to address that. This is for an organized event. And doesn't have to be entertainment. I guess you could have a rally of some type if you want, but truly a protest would not be something that we regulate in the zoning ordinance.
Any other questions? Is the applicant here?
Yeah,
Please approach.
if you have any questions, my name's Lynn Ballard, one of the owners. Our family owns the property there, and we're longtime Ames residents. In fact, my dad had a construction company and then built Riverside Manor Nursing Home. And that's where that property came to be. That wasn't sold with the nursing home. But yeah, the Renaissance is put on by some Iowa State students, and we offered to help host it. The porta potties, take care of all the management, the insurance, and all that is our input. It's a very small scale. We had one police officer there last year, and they commented it's a family event. I believe it's from like 10 to 4 or 5 in the afternoon, maybe 6. We're not anything like the Sleepy Hollows or the Kansas City or the Minneapolis as far as our site. As far as anybody structurally setting things up, we bring a flatbed trailer in for a stage. And other than that, the 15, 20 vendors are in and out in a matter of hours. And our intention is never to go over 2 weekends. I know weather and things like that, that's the risk, but it would be just, and I appreciate the 4 days because, what little setup there is easily done on Friday, and the show is Saturday and Sunday, and then they're out of there that night. I mean, they tear down to get out. But if you have any other questions about it, our involvement,
what we need to do to move forward with this.
Have you, Iowa State is, students are the ones
Yeah.
that have,
Yep.
have you had any other questions about availability for other types of
Oh,
events?
we one time had and we've worked with a few nonprofits as far as doing, one time we were going to do a car show, different things during the day. We have no lighting per se. So we're a daytime operation, and I understand the rules for 2 events. And the only way, the city of Ames has used it for RAGBRAI and for fireworks and some other things, and that's fine. You guys are welcome to use it for anything that comes up. But as far as us personally, I don't know, a car show, people swap meet, or what do you call when they set up all their tables and stuff?
So would those generally be under the 100-person
Oh, no,
threshold?
I
Would
think,
there be more
if you
than
had to
100?
say over 2 days, I think we had 2,000.
Oh.
But if you'd come out and view it, I relate it to a church picnic. We have a lot of room. We have ample parking for anybody. Iowa State and us, we had a little quarrel. They have a G6 football lot, and gosh, they came and barricaded all that up so we wouldn't use it. But we've had conversation about that. That caused a lot of tie-up for kids for soccer. There were a couple accidents, parking on the road since they closed their lot. So I think they'll let us use it this year because we open our lot up then for Hilton games, just about anything they ask. We started out parking, $1 a car, enough money to go to Hickory Park. And that's how that property stayed in the family and was never sold. And then the Haunted Forest thing went for about 20 years. And are we ever glad to have that out of there? I mean, the labor intensive, and it just came to that, our kids and the involvement with my dad when we started it. But yeah, it was just too much. And I'll be honest, I thought it was an eyesore.
I was asking about like the swap meets or the
Yeah.
car shows. Do they go over the 100
People,
people?
I hope so. So I don't know. We've had some things that we have to do as far as crowd control and things like that. And we've hired always anything we've had the police there, and the comments always, geez, one's plenty. It's people roaming around at the Renaissance. There's no, we have a couple stage shows or these guys put on things, but we're not big enough. We can't afford the horse thing when they do jousting. That's way out of our league. And that's, I understand. If we did other events with Justin, we'd approach and say, is this, feasible? And we don't have neighbors per se for noise or anything. It's just what you folks allow.
Any other questions?
Did you have any concerns about any of the restrictions listed that we should talk about?
I know, boy, it seems so simple and it gets so complicated. As far as security, and we're dealing with 2 fire marshals, one Dave Folkman, and then the inspector. And last year they wanted a fence around every generator. And gee whiz, I said, I'm 72, I just can't do it. Well, found out there's only 3 people that use generators. But they gave us kind of a rough time because I said, gee, what if they have the pickup behind the tent or their little snow cone booth and put it back there? I understand if somebody would get back there, there's a chance to get burnt. But I know there are a lot of restrictions. But you have to protect the public, where it's kind of a common sense thing for me, but it goes a bit further.
Okay, thank you.
And we're for sure, gosh, we're available 24/7. We live in Ankeny. Our roots are all from Ames. But gosh, we'll make anything work. We're not to pull a quick one or sneak something through anybody as far as the wiring and fire marshal, crowd control. If you saw the crowd, you'd say, oh my God, yeah, there's never a big crowd there. They can go right in. And I'd say, maybe there's several hundred at a time they come and go, but we have no problem with crowd control. We have no problem with parking with all our parking we use for Iowa State. So parking isn't an issue. We're off-site, so we wouldn't bother any streets. Easy access. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone from the public want to approach and make comments or have questions? Okay, any concluding remarks or questions? Do we have a motion?
Move approval of alternative 1. The Planning and Zoning Commission recommend that the city council approve a zoning or text or amendment creating a permit for special temporary events in section 29.1501, parent 1, parent D, and creating criteria for permit review in newly created section 29.1318.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. Next on the agenda is text amendment to the conservation subdivision ordinance.
Good evening. So this amendment applies to, as you can see on your screen, typically areas within the Ada Hayden watershed have to meet a separate standard for subdivisions called conservation design subdivisions. So within the Ada Hayden watershed, there's a few current developments that would be impacted. There's Hayden's Preserve and Auburn Trail along Hyde, and then there's potentially a future development along George Washington Carver that's partially within the watershed boundary too. While this could apply to other parts of the city or areas within 2 miles of the city where we have extraterritorial review of subdivisions, that's at the discretion of council if there's natural resources. So this is just to frame our discussion, typically where this ordinance will apply. So I'm going to go through the main changes. I think overall, though, the ordinance was amended to create more flexibility, to remove some of our numeric standards that were strict numeric standards. As you can see up on the screen, it says 80% of lots have to abut open space in the current ordinance, but still maintain, the intent of the ordinance while making those changes. And this was prompted by a request from the Ames Economic Development Commission to City Council as part of some broader changes requested to the zoning ordinance to help spur housing development and create flexibility within the ordinance. So the first change is a removal of the requirement that 80% of lots in these conservation design subdivisions abut open space. I've included an example above. So to meet this requirement, you would have lots adjacent to these large conservation areas or create other open spaces, that might have a dual purpose, such as these, like stormwater conveyance. Houses would abut these areas, and it would create the character of a larger lot, having these areas adjacent, as well as access to natural resources. So while we're removing this strict 80% of lots have to abut conservation areas, we're still maintaining that all lots have to have access. There has to be clear access to conservation areas, pedestrian connectivity, and conservation areas, larger conservation areas, should be dispersed throughout the development. So if you're doing a development and you just have one large conservation area at one end, that won't meet the standard. They still need to be dispersed throughout the development. The next change is also a change to a numeric requirement in this code. So 25% of a subdivision under the current ordinance has to be open space. In this area, there aren't necessarily a lot of natural resources, prairies, forests. There's a lot of farmland. And so as a result, in some subdivisions, we've seen more open space be required under this than there are actual natural resources. So then that open space has to be naturalized, preserved in a conservation easement, even if there isn't, a wetland or a prairie there. So the change to the ordinance that's proposed is to remove that 25% of the conservation subdivision has to be set aside, and instead require that natural features identified in an inventory have to be part of those conservation areas. We still will have a base requirement of 10% open space under our zoning code. So most residential floating suburban zones have a requirement that there's 10% open space required. So that will still stand. It's just the additional 25% that's required under the conservation ordinance is proposed to be struck. So with these two changes, I think you probably can clearly see, especially with this change, we might have more density or intensity with these subdivisions, right? If you don't have a 25% set aside for open space, what goes in that open space? Well, more lots. And so given that we could see more lots in this area, given that it's the Ada Hayden watershed, we have goals to protect Ada Hayden. Council did have us hire a consultant to study the impacts of these changes on the Ada Hayden watershed. And they specifically looked at how could more development intensity, which would result in more stormwater runoff, impact the lake. And the result was, we could have more runoff resulting from these increased impervious surfaces, but the consultant recommended a set of best management practices be adopted as part of the ordinance to offset those impacts, and specifically in terms of water quality. So the next slide goes through new enhanced stormwater management practices that have been introduced to offset any increases in stormwater runoff and pollution that may occur from these changes. So the enhanced stormwater best management practices really rely on this idea of a treatment train, where instead of having one detention pond at the end of subdivision that takes all the runoff, we instead intercept the runoff throughout the subdivision. It goes through a series of different practices that have different purposes. Some might capture sediment, others might infiltrate runoff through open conveyance before it reaches its detention basin. And that allows pollutants to be filtered out of the runoff before it's eventually discharged into the greater watershed. So we've written standards to use this approach to provide information on what percentage of pollutants is anticipated to be removed with each practice. And then we've also included some more specific practices that have to be used. So a sediment basin during construction, so when there's exposed soil and rain hits the ground, a sediment basin to catch that erosion should be in place. And then a requirement that forebays, which is another type of sediment basin, are used before the detention ponds to help catch sediment as well. And then we've also included new requirements to site lots and roadways to take advantage of natural topography, and use shared access points to reduce impervious surfaces. And this is kind of towards that idea of low impact development in this area. So reducing runoff and grading and impacts to natural areas. One of the other main changes that was made, we have, again, this ordinance hinges on there's an inventory of natural resources done, then the subdivision's designed around those natural resources. And one of the natural resources that's required to be inventoried are wetlands. The current ordinance standards just state that wetlands should be inventoried, included in conservation areas. The way that this ordinance has been put in practice is that not all wetlands are required to be in conservation areas. We have been only applying this to jurisdictional wetlands. And so what you see on your screen is jurisdictional wetlands are those that the Army Corps has permitting authority over. That's because they're adjacent to rivers or streams that the Army Corps has permitting authority over. It's not what you might see on your right-hand side, which is a prairie pothole wetland that are separated from a waterway. And so I wanted to make that clear. The ordinance has only really ever been applied to jurisdictional wetlands, but now we're making changes to make that clear. We're adding that jurisdictional word in front of wetlands in the ordinance. We are also introducing a buffer requirement based on a wetland size and vegetative classes, a distance outside of the wetland to be protected to help with, establishing healthy vegetation and protect them from pollution. And other wetlands are still encouraged to be retained. So if there was a prairie pothole wetland on a site, we would encourage it to be retained or used for stormwater management. But we're just clarifying that it's not one required to be in a conservation area. And then another change related to flexibility of development standards are our street length and design standards. So this is actually in our subdivision code that applies to all subdivisions. We have standards that limit the use of dead-end streets and establish a preferred block length. And if you can imagine a subdivision design where we're required to have, a grid pattern with a certain block length, that might not always make the most sense for a subdivision where you have natural features with steep slopes, wetlands that you want to design around. You might need some flexibility to put in a dead-end street so you don't put your road through a wetland or another natural feature. And so that's what we've introduced, an allowance to use cul-de-sacs more than you might otherwise to protect natural resources. But we did add that you should maintain pedestrian connectivity at the end of those dead-end streets. And there are also potential changes to our floating suburban development standards related to block lengths in a similar way to create some flexibility when there's natural resources. And then our final main change is about mass grading. So when a site is being developed, it's graded so that the topography of the land is appropriate to site roads and then lots, and everything slopes, so we don't have issues with ponding. And so mass grading in the current conservation ordinance is supposed to be minimized, but that was never really defined as what that meant. So now we're being clear that no grading in conservation areas of natural resources is permitted. There are exceptions if there's critical infrastructure that has to happen. The public works director could approve an exception, or if restoration of a feature is needed, but otherwise no grading is allowed in those areas. And again, we are encouraging the use of natural topography for road and lot layout to still minimize mass grading in other places that aren't natural areas on the site. So those are the main changes to the ordinance. I think the overall theme is, while we're creating some flexibility, we're doing so at the same time as really emphasizing standards for stormwater management that's enhanced stormwater management to better protect the lake and its water quality, and really kind of shore up some of our standards for natural resource protection in terms of what's in a conservation area, when is grading allowed, those types of issues. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
So you never did have any say over the wetlands that weren't jurisdictional?
Yeah, so when we were looking at this ordinance, we worked with the previous municipal engineer and did learn that it was allowed to grading or filling was allowed of non-jurisdictional wetlands, and technically jurisdictional if the Corps gave permission.
I don't think there were any non-jurisdictional wetlands in any of the two projects that were approved previously, so it was probably a non-issue at that point. The change in jurisdictional definition makes it a more important issue, because less things are under the jurisdiction of the Corps now than they were 2 years ago.
So I got a number of questions, but I guess the first one, I guess kind of first two, could you pull up the map of Ada Hayden there and point out, I guess, I don't, maybe it's.
Sure, it
extends
got cut
past-
off a little bit on my PowerPoint.
Oh, no, I was just wondering where I mean, we kind of know what the eastern side of it is, but where does the watershed extend to, I guess?
Yeah.
It's the
So
blue line
it's a
there,
blue
is
line,
that what
and
it
it
is?
goes up
How far does it go?
past 190th, quarter a half mile, and it doesn't cross. It stays east of George Washington Carver and kind of west of 69 in that general area.
Okay. And then I guess for everyone that's maybe not aware, so Ada Hayden's not just, a beautiful amenity, I guess. One thing about it too, I guess, can you speak a little bit to how it's used for the water supply for the city of Ames? Or source water in times of drought?
Yes, so I believe in times of drought, water can be released from the lake into the river, whereas we would get our the wells go into the aquifer that the river recharges. And so in times of drought, when there isn't water in the river, those wells, the aquifers and thus the wells can't recharge. So by adding water from Ada Hayden, it would allow for some recharge of the city's drinking water wells. Did I get that right, Kelly?
As far as I understand, yes.
Great.
And has that
I-
ever happened?
It sounded good to me.
Yeah.
I know
Yeah,
a little bit about that, so.
So it's not directly taken from the lake. It's a recharge through infiltration into groundwater and then the aquifer and back up into the wells.
I know they did take water out of the lake back in the late 70s. I was still in college, and I was here one summer, and it was very, very dry. And they actually pumped water out into the river from the lake.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm
that
not
would have
aware of
been-
any in the last 15 years that I've lived in
When it
Ames,
was
but
privately
yeah.
owned still.
Yeah,
Yeah.
summer 77. I
It was a
think.
yeah, it was a quarry then.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was
Since it's been the park, I don't believe it's been used in that way.
I don't think so.
But to your question, Michael, I think that from a water quality perspective, we're looking at it more in terms of, nitrogen and phosphorus that could go downstream and impact, the aesthetic quality or the quality of the lake for, fish and other things.
Yeah. I was just make sure that people are aware too that the reason it exists, one of the major reasons is to serve for that water supply reason. That was one of the reasons it was created in the first place, and so that's a reason for the drinking water impact as well. So.
And I will also note, these sites are currently farm fields. And so we do believe that with the level of treatment provided, we will have cleaner water running off once development occurs rather than in its untreated state running off from a farm field.
So the quality might actually go up.
That's possible, yes.
And are the offsets, the compromise of these other things, did the consultant weigh that would have the same impact as not?
Yes.
having-
So I think what the consultant really looked at was the potential for density increases, and so lot increases, and therefore how much more runoff we might see. And then we also asked them to suggest practices. And really what it comes down to is when you use practices in a treatment train, multiple different practices, you can achieve up to, in some cases, 80% removal of total suspended solids from runoff, which is sediment, which is a pretty high level. And especially when you have multiple practices on a site, that takes out the risk of one practice failing as well. And so it should, offset the increase in runoff. But the actual, I just wanted to point out that the actual increase in runoff isn't the issue. It's the water quality that goes with it, because under our current stormwater management ordinance, we do require only a certain rate of runoff be allowed to leave the site. So it's not overwhelming or creating other downstream flooding issues.
I'm wondering if the consultant, did they look at, so what, I'm just kind of curious, and maybe that you don't know the answer to this, but the, decrease in the percent from 25 to 10, but what, I guess, stormwater BMPs and low impact development also take up some space. I guess what percent do you think would be necessary for implementing those? And it sounds like it'll meet the 10%, but I'm wondering what that number might be, or if there's an idea of.
That's a good question. I don't think I can directly answer it, but we did provide the stormwater plant management plans to the consultant as part of their review. So they looked at those. And I think a lot of them actually currently use this treatment train approach through working on the designs with these developers. And so I don't think any real additional space would be needed for the treatment train practices. I will note, because we are having higher densities, additional detention area might be required, but it would be nowhere near the size to offset the gains in density that would be made. We did look at that, and I'm not remembering the specific increase in size for the detention areas, but it wasn't significant compared to the 5 to 15% increase in lots that would be able to be attained.
I want to be clear that even though the numeric requirement drops to 10, the requirement is natural areas must be conserved. So if you need 13% of your site to conserve a grass waterway and a stream that goes through there, you're going to have to do that.
Yeah.
So that's how this is now being written. I think we're truly getting those artificial green separation areas out that were not natural or just there to meet a number. Those are what are going to be gone. The actual conservation areas that have some meaning will be retained.
Okay.
And thinking and I don't know if this was part of your question or not. When we looked at it from a development perspective, we were assuming 5 to 10% unit count increases for developers with the change of area. We did not go back in and redesign how a conservation area might be altered differently to get more or less lots. We kind of just looked at a macro level of more land is available for development.
Another thing I was just I don't know, I guess with these two developments, do you see them going with the treatment train approach or a combination of that and the low impact development?
So I guess both
do we
would
know?
be required under these
Okay.
changes. So they'll have to do a treatment train approach and then also, work with natural topography as appropriate. But I will say, based on both of their stormwater management plans that they've already submitted for past layouts, it does appear that they are already using a treatment train approach.
One thing I would just mention, I guess I have a little bit of experience in this stormwater design and kind of some of these things. In low impact development, I've seen some developments that have used it 10, 15 years, 20 years after. And the idea is you have like the backyards are kind of match the natural topography, and that's where the drainage ways are. They can look not so great after a period of time with how that. So that's just something. If you're doing that, as far as maintaining them and just kind of the aesthetic may not be what people think when it first goes in. That was one thing. I guess the other question I had, this is kind of a side thing, but will this be on city sewer or will they be required to? Okay. Because there could also be a water quality impact if they're going on-site treatment for.
No, everything in the city
every
is on
city
city
sewer.
sewer.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the reason you annex to the city is so you can get urban densities.
Yeah, I seem to remember some time ago some development wanting to come in this area and use on-site treatment, and there was a question about the impact to.
That would be the whole genesis of North Growth
Sure.
from
Sure.
2007.
Yeah,
We
that was a long. Yeah.
won't regale you with those tales.
I don't know. Does anyone else have any other questions? Oh, okay. I have one. Another one. As far as the low impact development and I guess the stormwater BMPs, would those be maintained by the city like other places in town are now, or would they be required to be maintained by the developer or the homeowner, or how would that work?
The city doesn't generally maintain BMPs. It's really the subdivisions requirement. So
Okay.
so just to explain, so there's chapter 5B, which is our municipal code requirement for stormwater management. So that's going to apply to all these projects, just like every other site across the city. The conservation is extra. So within chapter 5B is where the maintenance responsibilities lie. So when a new subdivision is approved, whether it's here or somewhere else, those stormwater features will be in common areas. The HOA will have a general maintenance requirement. The city, as part of our stormwater utility fund, would do long-term dredging of a detention pond, something that's a capacity issue, but the general maintenance of those facilities is expected from the HOAs. And so that same expectation would be here.
So there would be some maintenance provided by the city, but it's paid by the stormwater utility
So
ratepayers.
yeah, it
Which
is
would include
really
these projects.
infrequent, large scale
Right.
capacity issues. Part of our, like, think of it as stormwater system capacity issues. That's when we get involved.
Okay.
The performance of keeping the landscaping in place, to mow that, to clean it up,
Right.
get debris out of there, that is not the city's responsibility.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's only for single family. If you're a commercial project, you have to do it all. The city council only provides that detention pond level of
For the volume.
service, essentially, for residential projects.
Okay.
Is there any way to enforce the homeowner association to provide this maintenance? I mean, what happens if,
To provide the what? The maintenance?
yeah, on the drainage? I mean,
I think there's a couple. I don't administer that part, but there's a couple of different documents that go into the subdivisions with the final plats about obligations. There's easements put over them that expect and require things. If the city had to come do it, we would assess it back to the people that are supposed to do it. So I don't know that that's happened. There's not a lot of regular maintenance that's needed, but that would be administered through the engineering division.
and I have a question on the grading in the conservation areas.
Yeah.
Would it be allowable if it improves the function?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So they'd provide a plan for restoration, and that Public Works would review and approve to allow that work to occur. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to avoid is that mass grading was kind of nebulous on what it meant. It meant a few different things to different people. So we said, well, our focus here is now specific natural resources. We don't want you scraping out topsoil and using it somewhere else. And then if you didn't change the grade, we don't want you to just go harvest the soil from that area. We want to keep it where it's going to be used and where it's most beneficial for the natural resource. And that's really our intent here. So restoration will always be encouraged. And as Amelia said, some other adjustments will happen. It's just you can't scrape the site and just recreate everything.
Any other questions? Mike?
I guess, yeah, just one more, I guess. I keep saying that, but I guess I'm familiar with some of the areas in town that have implemented some of these practices, but has there been anywhere in town that, because this, I imagine this would be one of the larger instances of, as far as capacity and scope of doing low impact development and kind of stormwater BMPs in a development. Is that true, or are there other places that this has been done to some success, or what's the history there? I'm just familiar with some of the like public right-of-way projects, I guess.
So in the conservation ordinance jurisdiction, there's two projects, Quarry Estates and Hayden's Crossing, which are the two shown at the top of Ada Hayden up there. Every subdivision has stormwater detention requirements.
Right.
It's 2013 and before. I would say nuanced treatment trains are not common in residential subdivisions. You might see a little bit more of that on commercial sites because they're trying to mitigate use of large detention areas. Residential subdivisions kind of just devote large areas to detention, and that's their answer.
Right.
I think what you're going to see, correct me when I'm wrong, I think you're going to see a lot of surface water flowage through grassy swales, which is not hard to maintain and it's easy to do.
Right.
And we have that in many places in the city. I think the bio cells, things like you see in the city projects, I don't expect that to be done by private developers.
Okay, do we have a motion? I recommend City Council approve the text amendment to the Conservation Subdivision Ordinance and related provisions based upon the draft language of Attachment C. Note, prior to City Council review, the language will be finalized with the City Attorney's Office as a draft ordinance.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Motion passes. And the next item on the agenda is zoning text amendment regarding townhome building types.
All right, I just got a coughing spell, so this might get awkward. But, so tonight we're following up on one of the last infill directions we have from City Council. As we describe here, a townhome is kind of a generic term for multiple building looks, and we're asking to create it as a specific dwelling type. And essentially, it would allow for apartments, which you could build now, but have an altered parking requirement because you're providing covered parking. So if you are not on an individual lot and you have 3 or more units attached, whether they're above you, next to you, whatever, you're just an apartment building in our code. And we treat you as parking on a per bedroom basis for that. So to encourage from an infill perspective, an opportunity maybe to have something that's a little bit smaller scale, and again, have maybe possibly a higher amenity level by having covered parking rather than surface parking. We wanted to encourage that with townhomes for development. So this unit type, and we list out a few of the things that are going to go into this. The parking reduction is really based on a 3-bedroom module for the townhome. So if you have 2 parking spaces, that would be fine for a 3-bedroom unit. If you have 4 or more bedrooms in it, then you're going to be treated as an apartment building and have to park it at a per bedroom rate, just like anything else. And then again, because of the scale, we're looking at this as only applying to smaller arrangements of units. So the proposal is for 5 attached or less. You could have a total of 8 on a site, so you could split it 4 and 4, 5 and 3, different configurations to try and encourage that. But it is still supposed to be a smaller scale of infill project. Now, if you want to do more and you go to a PUD, the language would allow you through the PUD process to pursue a larger townhome development and possibly take advantage of this from a rental perspective. Again, so if you're building single family attached on individual lots, none of this would matter. It's only if you're not dividing into individual lots and you're essentially providing for a rental product. Now, again, in the vein of infill, as we did with ADUs and duplexes, we have some expectations that for this benefit and this relief, that we have some design elements. And so we're using some very basic expectations that the end units or the buildings do have essentially a front face to the street. And we went through this in the infill presentation, which was in 2023. So it's been almost a year and a half since you would have seen that. But there is a lot of bad patterns of townhomes where the easiest thing to do as a developer is to line up 5 townhomes perpendicular to the street, have a sidewall, never see anything except for the side of a building, and then just 5 garage doors down a lane. So that's super efficient, easy to do, not good for a neighborhood character. So we're asking that if ultimately we really prefer is that the units are rotated and you have at least a face of a unit or 2 facing the street, and units behind can be however they're done. But in the event that's not possible, you would still have to have an end unit that essentially has the look of a residential unit. The way we talked about it today on a different project was it should look like a house with a side loading garage. So if you're on a corner, you should look like you have a front face on one side of the corner and you should have your garage on the other. So there's a lot of examples of token efforts to have a covered entry or something that just looks tacked on. We're going to have to see how we can massage that language to push it to a little bit better than that, because I think that's our intent. As we referenced here, there are some cities that have had really prescriptive expectations, like Denver really revolted against this idea of just what they called slot homes, these sequential townhomes just being laid out over and over again with no interface with the street. So they have very prescriptive standards about how you must put fronts of townhomes along streets. Des Moines, another city that has a requirement that 70% of a street frontage must have townhome frontage on it to try and avoid this side-loaded design process. So we weren't going that far, but we're going to put some design criteria. And part of this is because it's a small unit infill project. If it's a PUD, again, it's a different evaluation process and different standards that would go there. Now, one of the questions that I think is up for debate is what zones to allow this in. We talked about this, that a townhome or an apartment is not allowed in every zoning district in the city. So essentially the RL, the UCRM, and the RMOSFC, which are residential low density areas or areas that are intended to conserve single family character, they don't allow this building type. So without any outreach to discuss this with these kind of specific neighborhoods, we are proposing to include it within the areas that you already would see this type of unit, either as single family attached or as a apartment project, and then allow again for a PUD. So we're recommending to not do this across the city, just to do it where it's essentially medium density, or again, single family residential where single family townhomes are already allowed. The PUD overlay would always be an option now. You can do that on an infill site. You used to have 2 acres. With the recent changes we made with the pocket neighborhood options, we changed it. So if you had an oversized RL zoned lot, let's say you had a 3/4 acre site for some reason, very few of those in the city, you could come in with a PUD and you could do townhomes through that PUD. Staff would not be the review authority. You'd have to go through the commission and council to do that. So we think that if there is a real infill site, the PUD option is still there. We don't have to bring this in as an administrative approval like we would in the more the higher density areas. And then the extra recommendation we have is, in addition to those regular zones, we think that that it would be beneficial as a first step in the university impact overlays to also allow it. So around campus, we have a west and an east university impact area. And what they do is they have some design requirements for apartments, some very minimal basic things, and some material requirements like brick and some entry orientation. But they have extra parking required. So there's a 25% extra parking requirement adjacent to campus compared to anywhere else in the city. So we think that for some of these smaller sites that have older homes on them, have deeper lots, there's definitely potential for townhome. It'll unfortunately be the perpendicular style because they don't have a lot of frontage. But we think if we take a parking space off of that requirement with the townhome that we're proposing, that would definitely incent some of those things being converted from one rental house to 1 to 5 townhomes. Or I can't have one townhome, multiple townhomes on the site. So we would recommend doing that at this point in time. I think over time we're going to revisit the whole university area overlay as a more of a comprehensive approach. We have a direction to look at the area south of campus specifically, which is in this university area as a redirection area. So we'll more holistically look at that. But I think for this point in time, I would like to move ahead with a townhome option that does have a space reduction compared to what the overlay does now. And I will note that that was not in the listed alternative 1. It was in the text of the report. So if you do move alternative 1, I would request that you add the university overlay to the list of areas that could take advantage of this proposal. So with that, I take any questions about what we're trying to accomplish. If there's some suggestions on features or standards that you'd like to see adjusted, I'd be welcome to that as well.
Anyone? Okay, do we have a motion?
I'll recommend City Council approve the text amendment to create a townhome building type within Article 4 of the zoning ordinance with size limitations and design requirements and a parking reduction for 3-bedroom or less units, along with corresponding changes to the PUD overlay and for the use and parking reduction, and to allow the townhome building types within the South Lincoln Mixed Use Special District, RM, FSRM, FSRL, RH zoning districts, and the university overlay.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes.
Excellent. I'll tell the other planners they were too slow in getting their text amendments approved tonight.
You snooze, you lose.
All right. So our next meeting is the,
So we're going to cancel. So we had some emails about this. So
Right.
while 5 of you are here, I just want to touch base with you. So our next supposed meeting was January 1st. That's canceled. There's no replacement for that meeting. Your normal regular meeting is January 15th. What we've asked, and this happens every year, is your first meeting in February can conflict with council budget discussions. So what I'm asking is, in lieu of that first meeting in February, could we plan for January 29th? So we would then possibly have 2 meetings in January, 1 meeting in February. And that would, I think that fits our schedule a little bit better. And if we have an item that needs space for people, February is not good when we put you in 235. So I would like to look at that date. I think we've had, how many people say they can make it so far? 3.
Did you say 2 meetings in January or just one?
Well, we would keep the 15th if we need it, and then establish the 29th in place of the first February meeting is what I would prefer. Or if the council's, or not the council, if the commission's interested in that. So if you have not replied to Eileen, if you could do that as soon as possible so we could kind of plan our calendars out, that would be great. And we don't have to have all 7. I'd like to have at least 5. I don't want to really just go with 4. That's never a good night when we have 4 of you. So I'd hope to get 5 or 6 at least for the 29th. Anyone know for sure that they can or can't make it?
I cannot. Out of town.
You're out for sure.
Yep.
I'm in.
I'll make it.
I'll be there.
You'll be there. So that's
4 right
that's
there.
4. Okay. So I think so yeah, we'll confirm that with you. But that's the plan. Okay.
Has there been, I listened to the city council meeting concerning the Romero House request. How is that coming? Well, I know they voted on a kind of a compromise.
So on December 10th, council approved on first reading an ordinance. If you remember, the proposal was to allow social service providers by special use permit anywhere within the single family conservation overlay. There's about 350 properties that applies to. The commission voted in favor of allowing for that. The council approved a modified version, which is only properties abutting commercial zoning, which is Clark and part of 7th Street, are properties that could be approved for an additional social service provider use, with the limit of only 1 additional social service provider being established in that area. There's already 3 in those 4 blocks that would apply to. So that was approved on first reading. There's a pending appeal of process with the Zoning Board of Adjustment. So the final readings of those ordinances won't happen until January to be approved if that happens.
And the one meaning organization, or like the Romero House would be?
It is not and cannot be organizational specific. It is an allowance for 1 additional property to have a social service provider use approved by the Zoning Board of Adjustment.
And is the Romero House would already be there, and would that be the opportunity to try for the the one,
So the Romero House is not legally established as a social service provider. They're trying to establish that at 702 Clark.
okay,
So their yellow house, their 709 Clark is not legally a social service provider use.
thank you.
Sure.
Motion to adjourn?
Second, yep.